Hey, Oliver, it's okay. Well, there we go. We did it, buddy. Maybe. Sounds so good to me.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Kayleen Asbo, and it is a joy and a pleasure to be with you this evening. We are going to be exploring the intriguing character of Mary Magdalene from many perspectives tonight, but as we begin, I'm going to ask you to please look and see if you can make sure that you are muted right now, because we are going to record this to share with other people. And I can hear a barking dog and some dishes going on in the background. So it would be wonderful if you could just help us out. There'll be a time later on where we can invite conversation. But for now, if you could just make sure that you are all muted. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So as we begin today, I want to just invite you to look inside your heart and see if there is a word that comes to mind when you think of this intriguing figure that we're going to explore tonight, Mary Magdalene. What are the first words that come up to mind for you? I want to invite you to put those in the chat box right now. I always love to know what is happening. And Gail Hall, could you please mute yourself, my friend? Because we're hearing, thank you so much. Great. Okay, and Susan, if you would please just keep an eye on that for us, that would be so helpful. So the first word that I'm seeing, Maura, is forgotten. Oh, thank you. Mysterious, precious, love. So wonderful. Please add your own words. Misunderstood. Who else is Mary Magdalene for you? Misrepresented, erased, mystical, a supporter of Jesus, beloved, disciple, peaceful. These are wonderful, wonderful words to begin with. And Susan, I think that might be your screen that's showing, because it's Not
Gee. Mm-hmm.
somebody else has their screen on. Okay. And I don't know who you are, but there's someone on an iPhone, and it just says iPhone. And if you could turn off your sound too, if you could mute that, that would help us out so much. Thank you.
Turn off my sound. Is that what you said?
To mute yourself, yeah, for our recording. We need to have a muted part first so that people will be able to hear the speaking part. Thank you. All right, so we're going to be exploring this figure from several different perspectives. This has been a lifetime's work for me. I spent the past 25 years tracing down Mary Magdalene all over the world, most particularly in Europe and in France, which we'll explore. But I want to begin by looking at her in several different contexts so that we can wrap our arms around this intriguing, mysterious, beloved disciple. And I just want to start with this image of St. Alban's prayer book and just invite you. We're going to explore her in text, in legend, in myth, in history, and in image. And as we begin, I want to invite you, as we're going through the images, to notice which ones really speak to you, which images surprise you, which images might be a little uncomfortable. And what do you think the story the image is telling you? So this is a very fascinating prayer book, St. Alban's, and this is a medieval illuminated manuscript. And just notice here we have Mary Magdalene with a halo around her. And she has her hand raised. I'm going to just invite you all to take this gesture with your own bodies, to make this gesture and just feel it for a moment, because this is a very important symbol iconographically in art. It's a symbol of teaching. It's a symbol of preaching. So this very beautiful, lustrous image has Mary Magdalene going to the disciples who are clustered together, and she's preaching to them. Very recently, just in the past few years, Pope Francis reinstated her original title, the title Apostle to the Apostles. So this is one of the earlier images that we have, an image that wasn't captured in art until centuries later, but an identity of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles. But for much of our history, Mary Magdalene has been in the shadows. Oh, Terry Holman, would you please make sure you're muted? Thank you. And once again, Susan, I'm just going to ask you to please keep an eye on that. Thanks so much. So this statue speaks to much of Mary Magdalene's journey across history. It's a statue that is in a site, a UNESCO heritage site in the Dordogne Valley called La Madeleine. Madeleine is the French version of Magdalene. And it was a site where a community of dedicated Mary Magdalene followers met for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. This particular statue that you see in this image this photograph was taken about 10 years ago. I first discovered this little chapel about 20 years ago. And when I first went in, the statue of Mary Magdalene was literally on the floor in the corner of this chapel, covered with dirt. And it broke my heart. There was nothing else in the chapel, but this chapel that was dedicated to her and named to her was in a profound state of neglect. When I came back several years later, you can see in this image, she had been lifted up. She'd been put on a simple table. And I brought some candles for devotion and I laid some flowers down. And a few years later, I came back. And that year, I found that not only was the statue clean and she had been elevated, but she had been brought into the light. And now, if you go to La Madeleine, you'll find an entire museum dedicated to the history of this place. You'll find a prayer box with coins, and you'll find candles to light, and you'll find offerings of flowers and prayers and petitions and devotion. She has literally been brought out of the earth, and the dirt and put back in a place of honor. And I think that that is a beautiful symbol for what we are experiencing right now in our own time. My first encounter with Mary Magdalene 25 years ago, all I knew was the song from Jesus Christ Superstar from when I was a little girl. I remembered that song. And I had some vague idea that she was some sort of penitent prostitute. And as I began researching 25 years ago, I was astonished to discover that she was not some peripheral character. Rather, she's what I like to describe as the very hinge upon which Christianity hangs. As we're going to discover, it is she and she alone that all four of the gospel writers agree was the first witness, the witness to death, the witness to new life. She was the first one who was chosen by Jesus to go and share a message of hope and good news. That history was erased over time, and we're going to explore a little bit about why that was and how that happened. So tonight, we're going to try to wrap our arms around 25 years of explorations that I've done. And we'll start with the biblical Mary Magdalene, and I'll point you in a direction where you can discover more on your own about the biblical Mary Magdalene quite easily. And you might be surprised, not so much by what is in the Bible about Mary Magdalene by that name, but by what is not in the Bible under that name. Then we're going to explore the historical Magdalene and who she was according to early documents and in the history books and texts that have been recovered in the 20th century. We'll then go to the French legends and traditions of Mary Magdalene, which constitute an enormous body of stories. And we'll explore the pilgrim path of Mary Magdalene that stretches from France to the British Isles before we dive into the archetypal Magdalene, this question that I think is really important.
Let me do it.
And Lou, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. This question of who she is to us inside our own being, whether or not we go to church, have any relationship with Christianity, she is appearing in astonishing ways to people of all faiths and no faith whatsoever in our own time. And I'll explore some of the art that's been created from this archetypal Magdalene, a figure that invites us to look upon the world with great courage and compassion, even in the darkest of days. And then finally, we're going to turn into the mystical Mary Magdalene, and we'll have a chance to explore an ancient practice called Visio Divina, a practice of working with images to see what they might have to say to you, to see what Mary Magdalene might whisper in the depth of your own heart. So I actually would like to start with a letter from the Middle Ages. Some of you may have heard of the very famous scholar Peter Abelard. He was what we would call a professor of philosophy, although it was before there were actual departments of universities. But he was a teacher of philosophy at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And he was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant intellects of his day. And he wrote this particular letter to a famous nun named Eloise, who had once loved dearly and in his youth. And he writes her this letter talking about how important it is for her to teach her nuns about Mary Magdalene and the other women of the New Testament. And he's encouraging her to turn her attention to Mary Magdalene. And the way that he does this is that he does this beautiful, beautiful exploration of who Mary Magdalene is if you go to the Bible. And he weaves together Matthew and Mark and other parts of this very long letter. He also has Luke and John. So I'm going to read this to you, this excellent summary of who Mary Magdalene is in the Bible. And I'm just going to invite you, as I read his words that are coming to us now from 800 years ago, to notice how they affect you and perhaps how they surprise you. As Mark says, Sorry. Very early in the morning, on the day of the resurrection itself, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, came to the tomb. And I have demonstrated the devotion of these women. Let me proceed to show the honor they merited. First of all, they were comforted by the angelic vision concerning the Lord's resurrection, now accomplished. And then they were the first to see and touch the Lord himself. Mary Magdalene, who was more faithful than the others, was the very first. After the angelic vision, she and the others with her, as is written in Matthew, left the tomb in fear and great rejoicing and ran to tell the news to his disciples. And while they were on their way, all at once Jesus met them and said, "All hail." And with that, they came near to him, clung to his feet, and worshiped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Go and give word to my brethren to go into Galilee, and they shall see me there." Luke also says it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, who had told the apostles this. And when the Lord himself appeared to Mary Magdalene, he said, "Return to my brethren and tell them this. I am going up to him who is my Father." And from these statements, we gather that these holy women were constituted, so to speak, apostles over the apostles, since they were sent to the apostles either by the Lord or by angels to announce the supreme joy of the resurrection for which all were waiting, and so that from them the apostles might first learn what they were later to preach to the whole world. Now, I don't know if you caught this, but the different gospel writers actually mention different people, and it's almost a game that you can play to spot the differences. And I want to encourage you to do this. If you're someone who delights, as I do, in biblical scholarship, you can use blueletterbible.com and you can put in any term. So you can type in Mary Magdalene. Some Bibles, she has no E at the end, and some she does, but by that name, you will find her. And you will discover that there is a very, very consistent portrayal of Mary Magdalene, in which she is the faithful disciple that all four of the gospel writers agree was present for the crucifixion, that all four gospel writers agree was present for the resurrection. And then there's one other depiction of Mary Magdalene that we see in Luke and then in a later version of Mark, in which there's the enigmatic phrase that she had 7 demons that were driven out of her. And as you might remember from biblical stories, Jesus was always casting out demons. It was one of the things he was famous for. It was one of the things that he was renowned, and why people flocked to him as a great healer, is that when people were suffering in mind, body, or spirit, he cleansed them and he made them whole and healed. So we have that reference with that interesting number of 7, which indicates symbolically in the ancient world a complete and total healing. Or if you were to take a leap across the centuries to Dante's Divine Comedy, if you had all seven peccatories or sins cast out of you, that meant that you had been thoroughly purified and you were actually an embodied saint, or what in Buddhism might be called an enlightened being. So that's who Mary Magdalene is, and only that in the Bible, in the New Testament, the faithful witness, the one who's commissioned, and the woman who is thoroughly healed. But that image got cut out over the centuries. And in this particular painting that I took at the Vatican Museum, I just invite you to notice if there's anything odd about it. You can start in the center and you can see the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. And then you can see that surrounding the image, there are various male saints with their halos. But I want to invite you to take your finger and literally touch the screen. Just touch the screen right at Mary's belly and then go to the left. I'm going to invite you to trace what I hope you'll see as a gaping hole in this picture. There's something missing. It's not a complete picture. Either something was deliberately cut out of the picture, or it never got finished somehow to have what the artist had in mind. And I think that this painting is a very evocative symbol for what happened over the centuries to Mary Magdalene. Whether you think of it as an unfinished painting that now we are in the process of trying to complete, or whether you think that an image was erased and was replaced by a later image, we're going to explore that. Because all four of those gospel stories have been portrayed across the centuries in art masterpieces. And we can very often find Mary Magdalene because more often than not, she is depicted in scarlet red robes. So I invite you to notice that we have the Virgin Mary in blue, as she's often depicted in art across the centuries, and she has her halo. But following her immediately is this woman in cardinal red. And notice how curious it is that actually the color red that she's wearing is exactly the same color that Jesus is wearing. And they're actually looking at each other. That's a very suggestive image about the importance of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, in this image, by this sculpture that we have here by Donatello, we have depicted in all four of the gospel accounts as being present for the crucifixion, present all the way until the body was taken down off of the cross. So one of the words that I would like to introduce for you to consider is, she was faithful. Or as Abelard said, the most faithful, the one that every gospel writer agrees. It's curious that, we only have Jesus's mother depicting in one of the biblical stories, but all of the gospel writers say that Mary was there. And so here in this image by Botticelli, there she is again with a cardinal red robe. And this time she's cradling Jesus in her arms. We have her across the centuries, often with long, unbound red hair, at the foot of the cross. And you can often find her as well because she's very often the most expressive person. She's weeping tears. And in fact, the word maudlin, a word that means to be full of tears, comes from an Old English pronunciation of her name, Magdalene and maudlin. So that image that we have just at the heart of the biblical story, I often say that, if you were to take scissors and you were to cut out the places where Mary Magdalene appears in the Gospels, you would actually cut out the hinges of Christianity because there would be no crucifixion and there would be no resurrection. Mary Magdalene, they all agree, was there. But I want to invite you to play a little game with me now, looking at this medieval painting where Mary Magdalene is front and center, right there at the feet of Jesus. Notice what happens to her. Oh, sorry. We'll go back to that in a second. We'll find how that happened historically. So here she is at the feet of Jesus. And then in the Gospel of John, she is the one and only first witness, this marvelous depiction, the longest depiction, where she calls Jesus the gardener, mistakes him for the gardener, and he calls her by name and then gives her the commissioning to go and bear news of the resurrection. So another image, Mary Magdalene, cardinal red robes, hand of teaching, preaching, and blessing, and the disciples. Now, there are so many other Marys in the New Testament, and some of them have also been identified with Mary Magdalene. The most famous is Mary of Bethany. This is the contemplative disciple of Jesus that Vermeer depicts so exquisitely in this masterwork, where she's sitting at his feet, absorbing his teaching, and her sister Martha complains that she's not helping with the household tasks. And Jesus comes to Mary of Bethany's defense and says that she has chosen, quote, the better part. This Mary is also the sister of Lazarus, whom Jesus resuscitates from death, and who, when he sees her weeping, also cries himself. So another female, beloved disciple who Jesus has an intimate friendship with. So let's just pause here for a moment, because this is one of those issues that has been hotly debated across the centuries. We know that, by the 4th century, St. Augustine was writing passionate letters and trying to decide, were Mary of Bethany and Mary of Magdalene the same woman or different women? And so back to Origen and others in Alexandria, this has been a hot debate. Rather than deciding which one is correct, because we can't really do that, I want to invite you to just consider this question that has teased and tantalized scholars across the centuries. How would it feel for you if Jesus had 2 such incredibly loyal female disciples? One whom he comes to the defense as she's absorbing his teaching, when her traditional role should have been in the kitchen helping prepare the meal, and who he has such close sympathy with that he himself cries, weeps, when he sees her own tears of grief. And then another female disciple, also named Mary, who's so faithful and loyal that after Peter has denied him, after Judas has sold him, after the other disciples have fled in fear, risking great danger herself, she stands loyal at the foot of the cross. I will tell you that in the French tradition, which I'm going to explore the most tonight, these are the same woman. That the word Christos means anointed one. And who is the woman who anoints Jesus's head in the house of Bethany? It's Mary. And so there have been many scholars, Jean-Yves Leloup amongst them, who have suggested that just as Jesus then becomes known as Christos, the Christ, Mary of Bethany, Mary of the house of Bethany, becomes known as Mary Magdalene. Magdalene is a word that also means tower and tower of strength, that she shifts her own name. Remember that Jesus was so fond of changing names that he changes Simon to Cephas or Peter. This is something that he was known of doing, is giving people nicknames that somehow conveyed some element of their character. And that Mary of Bethany then becomes known as Mary Magdalene, because she becomes this tower of strength at his crucifixion, and then the woman who is the bearer of the good news to the other disciples. So this is how she was known in the first few centuries. The historical Mary Magdalene, some of her earliest titles were not only the apostle to the apostles, but the Maestra Apostolorum. That's what's written here on this book, Magistra, the master of the apostles. And in this image here that we see, this is also an image found in Rome. She has an open book and she's pointing to the book in a way that we so often have teachers pointing to the books to their disciples. And in the right of this painting, you see it says Saint Barnabas, who was a companion of St. Paul's. It's interesting to note that at this church, this painting is only known by the title St. Barnabas and another saint. But if you know those breadcrumbs of history, that the Maestra Apostolorum, that the Magistra Apostolorum was Mary Magdalene, then you can put the pieces together. So how does that make you feel? Just notice and pause here for just a moment. That if we were to only look at Mary Magdalene as she appears in the New Testament and in the first few centuries where her title was the apostle to the apostles, how does that feel? I just like to pause and see if anybody would like to jump in and raise their hand and say something in response, or put something in the chat box. That if we were to only look at the biblical Magdalene and say, that's all that we can look at for who she is, what would that imply? What would that imply? Gail says it feels affirming. Maura says it feels like the powerful sacred feminine was squashed like it was a threat. Why was that? We stay in that place where we're really feeling who the biblical Mary Magdalene is. We have this triptych of images. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the evening because I feel so passionate and important about this. If the Bible itself tells us that Mary Magdalene was a figure who was front and center for all of the drama of the crucifixion and the resurrection, then why is it that we don't include her in our Holy Week liturgies? Why isn't she there in our readings? Most of the church liturgical readings on Sunday in the Christian church are of the race to the tomb with John and with Peter. And there is no pronouncement of her as the one who was the witness to the resurrection. Why is that? Isn't that rather shocking? Think about that. What could we do to reclaim her place in the beginning of Christianity? Just hold on to that thought. So, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, she is revered as the chief myrrh bearer. You see her here as the leader of the women. It is quite likely that the gender divides of those days meant that there needed to be women who administered to women in certain rituals. And this was brought up actually in the movie Mary Magdalene that was made a few years ago. There was this scene in which Mary becomes Jesus's hand upon his commissioning for the other women. But we see these vestiges of Mary as the leader of the myrrh bearers here, where there were many women, not just a few, there were many of whom are named in the New Testament, some of whose names have been forgotten because they're not named, but almost always they are unnamed within our modern church rituals. Now, why and what can we do about that? I think that's important. Now, we could also look at the historical Mary by including other texts of early Christianity that were not gathered together to become what we call the canonical Bible. This is something that is probably review for many of you, but it's, I think, important to underscore that the Bible as we know it was not something that was compiled until the 4th century, that originally it was actually an oral tradition of disciples who would go from town to town, sharing the stories that they knew about their teacher, their master, Jesus. And eventually the students, sometimes the students of the students of the students of those apostles, wrote them down. And the earliest text that we have, the Gospel of Mark, that's in the canonical text, is most likely at the earliest around the year 50. And the other texts go as late as, in some scholars' reckoning, 120, maybe even 130. So it was generations later that the stories of Jesus were written down. At the same time, those 4 stories were being written down. There were literally hundreds of other stories about what Jesus said, what he taught, and those traveled all throughout the ancient world, starting in the Mediterranean, but going over to Syria, to Turkey, to India. And each of these communities had different collections of stories, some of them parallel and some of them surprisingly different. So one of the things that's been most fascinating and exciting in our own time is that beginning at the end of the 19th century, a large number of these new documents have come to light, and they're not really new. They're very new, old documents, some of which might even be as old or older than the books that got collected in the New Testament as we know it.
After reporting feeling like
Linda Morris, could you, and thank you for muting. And so depending upon how you hold this, and people have different degrees of comfort and curiosity, whether they want to stay only with the biblical Mary Magdalene or whether they want to look at who she was in other Christian communities historically. All of these communities thought of themselves as being loyal followers of Jesus, but the views that they had often differed quite radically from the Christianity that coalesced in the 4th century and beyond as Rome became Christianized. It's amazing, actually, to discover the astonishing array of different beliefs in the first few centuries. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author and Princeton theologian Elaine Pagels calls this a riot of pluralism. She actually suggests in one of her Pulitzer Prize-winning books that the diversity in the first few centuries of Christianity was not anywhere approached in our own times until the 20th century. And if we think right now of all the different people who would consider themselves Christians, we have Catholics and Episcopalians, but we also have Buddhists and Church of God and Assembly of Christ and Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. And oh my goodness, the plethora of beliefs that are here. And she says that was very much what the first few centuries of Christianity were like. It's really interesting to notice that there were, for example, this is very well documented. The disciples in the first few generations of Christianity were arguing, even amongst his own disciples, do you need to become Jewish first before you can become Christian? Do you need to be circumcised and keep kosher law before you can be a follower of Jesus? We have that in the New Testament, those debates. And later on, there were Christians who believed in reincarnation, but were followers of Jesus, or who may have had practices that look more like Buddhism, but were followers of Jesus. So the variety is truly astonishing. And if we look at the documents then, of these first few centuries that have been recovered and now translated in the 20th century, that have been carbon dated, so we know when they're from, and some of them are from the 1st century through the 3rd century, so those early years, that the diversity of beliefs here is interesting. And what is also fascinating is that there is nothing to contradict the image of Mary Magdalene as the most loyal follower and the witness of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and the apostle to the apostles. But there's an expansion of that role where she is seen as, actually, one of her titles in these texts is the woman who knows all, or the embodiment of Sophia. And so we have these new texts like the Gospel of Mary that are new to us, but are very early Christian texts. And those provide a fascinating insight into who Mary Magdalene was as a revered teacher who Jesus tells and commissions to give a message of hope and good news. And the woman that the other disciples turn to in their fear and in their confusion. In the Gospel of Mary, we have Peter and Andrew and the other disciples saying, Mary, teach us give us the teachings that you know, because Jesus gave you special teachings that we did not receive. Really, really amazing to explore those texts. So now imagine that we have this loyal woman, the biblical Mary Magdalene, and we have all of these other communities of Christian, all spread out all over. And they're spread out in the Mediterranean, and they're as far away as India. There's a thriving church that's known as the Thomas Church, where the disciple Thomas brings texts and teachings that also revere Mary Magdalene as a teacher of profound wisdom. But when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, they wanted to regularize what was taught, and they drew up a list of the authorized books, the canon, if you will, of what the books of the Bible would be. So all those other texts that had been disseminated widely around many, many countries throughout the Middle East and beyond, these texts now were banned books. And they were ordered to be destroyed, or they simply fell into disuse. You have scholars debating, was there a targeted campaign to erase them from the history books, or did they merely fall by the wayside and disintegrate? I won't go into that debate. What I will say is that when that moment happened, when the other books, the other texts of Mary Magdalene began to be cut out, the role of women, the critical role of female disciples in the early Christian church also began to be cut out. And there's a host of fascinating and infuriating books to read about how this happened that will, if you're a woman, for me, it breaks my heart to read what happened and how women had such an egalitarian place in the first few centuries of Christianity. And little by little, they began to be pushed to the margins. Just as we're about to see, they were pushed to the margins through image. So I showed you that earlier depiction of Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, surrounded by the other figures who are in the Bible. Well, look at her now. She's still there right now with her long unbound hair, her long red hair, her red robes at the foot of Jesus. But now there are other people in the picture, and they're people who came much later. We actually have St. Francis and the Franciscans. Part of this image depicts how in later generations, and the Franciscans are certainly among them, Mary Magdalene was taken to be a model of virtue, someone whom they should follow in the footsteps of, particularly during Holy Week, when the Franciscans and the lay Franciscan communities would bathe people's head and anoint them and wash their feet and sing psalms of devotion to Mary Magdalene, as well as to Jesus and the Virgin Mary. So part of what you're seeing in the picture is this visual representation of, hey, everybody, follow in Mary Magdalene's footsteps. But look what happens over the centuries. Now Mary Magdalene's not at the foot of the cross anymore. She's pushed over in the margins. You can still see her. There's her red veil looking at Jesus. But now, instead of Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, there's other people there. There's St. Francis, who we can argue should certainly be there, but there's also the donors who painted for the painting, who probably shouldn't, if you're trying to capture a true spiritual portrait. So that's part of the piece of what happened, is she began to be marginalized. And then, in the 6th century, we had what Sarah Taft, the artist, has called the 14-year reputation of Pope Gregory. And Pope Gregory is a figure who's very complex, and there's a lot about Pope Gregory I love. We call it Gregorian chant because he was such a fan of having Gregorian chant, and he loves St. Benedict, and he wrote a biography about him. But Pope Gregory was living in a time where the world was collapsing and it was rife with violence and corruption. And as he looked upon what he saw as the collapse of civilization, he was really trying to hold up models of virtue. And part of what he did that hasn't gone acknowledged is that he was trying to hold up both Peter and Mary Magdalene as two figures who were flawed and human, but who gave their whole hearts to Jesus and became saints. So in a way, it was like pointing to somebody and saying, look at them, become like them. You too, no matter what you have done, you can aspire to follow in a holy saint's footsteps. But the way that he did that left a really unfortunate imprint. And in his own mind, the confusion that began to happen, not just between Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene, but between other women that are in Luke's gospel of the unnamed penitent woman who the disciples are horrified that she's bathing Jesus's feet with her tears, that it becomes woven in. And there was actually a real life penitent prostitute who was known as Mary of Egypt from the 4th century, and she gets woven in this. So this is Pope Gregory's homily, his Easter letter, his famous Easter letter. She whom John calls Mary, we believe to be the Mary, from whom 7 devils were ejected according to Mark. And this is Pope Gregory's invention. What did these devils signify if not all the vices? It is clear that the woman previously used the unguent to perfume her flesh in forbidden acts. What she therefore displayed most scandalously, she was now offering to God in a more praiseworthy manner. She had coveted with earthly eyes, but now through penitence, these are consumed with tears. She displayed her hair to set off her face, but now her hair dries her tears. She had spoken proud things with her mouth, but in kissing the Lord's feet, she now planted her mouth on the Redeemer's feet. For every delight, therefore, that she had had in herself, she now immolated herself, and she turned the mass of her crimes to virtues in order to serve God entirely in penance. Well, I want to hope that you notice a couple of things that nowhere in the Bible does it say any of this list of that these 7 demons or 7 devils were these sorts of things at all. In fact, nowhere in the Bible at all, when Jesus performs a healing or an exorcism, is it ever thought that the person was to blame. I'm sure Helen Borgen could lead you in some wonderful study and Lexio on that. But what happens here is that all of these unnamed 7 demons, 7 vices, become really sexualized. They become deeply sexualized. And it was a short little step from this, from Mary Magdalene as a penitent to Mary Magdalene as a penitent sinner, to Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, to Mary Magdalene as an adulteress. And over the centuries, we also then have depictions of Mary Magdalene that get more and more and more scandalous. She actually becomes an excuse for what Susan Haskins, the author, has said is sacred pornography, where when women's bodies were being forbidden from being shown, she's the only saint who's depicted voluptuous and naked. So this is one of the tamer images by Titian, in which her clothes are barely clinging to her, and you can see her with tears in her eyes, but clearly her body is expressing some very sensual tensions. And it becomes more and more lewd and lascivious over time. And she becomes the poster child for sensuality and sexuality at the very time that sexuality starts to become demonized. When St. Augustine's idea of original sin and sex as the gateway for all evil really takes root in the Catholic Church, and where celibacy starts to become a necessity for the priesthood, well, Carl Jung would say that Mary Magdalene becomes what's called as the shadow bearer, or the scapegoat for the repressed elements within Christianity. And that's why in those first depictions where Mary Magdalene in the New Testament itself is the loyal apostle and disciples, and how she ends up becoming the penitent prostitute has a lot more to do with our psychology and our collective shadow in Christianity than it does have anything to do with who the historical or the biblical Mary Magdalene really was. We do find traces still that the old Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, managed to endure, particularly within monasticism. Mary Magdalene, I devoutly hold, should be called the mystic mother tree. And we find as an example of that she is the patron saint of both the Franciscans and the Dominicans in the 13th century. And that's pretty fascinating, because the Franciscans and the Dominicans were really at odds with one another. They were actually enemies for several centuries, and yet both of them turned to Mary Magdalene. In fact, the Dominicans have OP after their name, for Order of Preachers. Fascinating that they turned to that as Mary Magdalene, because she was the first who preached the good news. So this image, I invite you to drink in deeply. This is the image that is found at the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi in the Magdalene Chapel, with the depictions of her life story that are collected from French legends. And what do you see? What do you see? I invite you to drink this in. We're not seeing a woman groveling and weeping from her penitent sins. Don't you see a woman standing very tall? In fact, I would call her a towering figure. Go ahead and put in the chat box, what are some characteristics, adjectives you would use to describe this image, which was painted by Giotto. And notice how she's standing in her cardinal red robes. And there actually is a cardinal who's kneeling kneeling, and he's holding her hand as if he is about to kiss her hand in devotion. She is tall. She is powerful. And this is the gesture actually that cardinals use when they are paying homage to the Pope. They kneel and they kiss the papal ring. Here she is with her golden halo. And in the medieval time, people were often not depicted according to how tall they literally were, but how they ranked in importance. So even if the cardinal were to stand up, wouldn't he only come to her shoulder? She is larger than life, as one of you said, but she also then is this towering figure. Remember, Magdalene means tower, towering figure of strength, who is worthy of our deepest, most reverent devotion. Wow. Wow. And that's the Mary Magdalene who's depicted on frescoes in so many monastery walls. That is the underground hidden thread of monasticism that has endured throughout the centuries. Here's another image in a monastery. This is the monastery of Saint-Michel-du-Var in Provence, the very region where her legends and the traditions associated with her are deepest, most deeply rooted. Now, what you're seeing on the wall, this is where the two walls come together, is the joining of myth and legend and then historical tradition. On the left is this boat of Bethany that, according to French legend, tells what happened to Mary Magdalene after the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection. As we're told in the Acts of the Apostles, there was this diaspora. The different disciples go off to different lands to preach and to teach. And according to French legend, Mary Magdalene first went to Alexandria, Egypt, which is where the Gospel of Mark was written and where the treasure trove of so many texts have only begun to be recovered in our own time that depict Mary Magdalene as a powerful spiritual leader with her own school of wisdom, her own following of disciples. After several years in Alexandria, where according to some people, that's where she may have written her own text, she and her brother Lazarus, her sister Martha, and other disciples set sail in a boat towards the Mediterranean. The boat managed to be broken in a storm. The mast was broken and it became a rudderless boat, but it found its way to the shores of Provence. Here, in the very joining of these two images, you see Mary Magdalene, again, as a towering figure with a red cloak. This one I call the red cloak of compassion. And it stretches over wall after wall after wall after wall of this monastery because it shows the centuries of saints who have followed in her footsteps. So according to French legend then, Mary Magdalene is the same Mary as Mary of Bethany. It's just she has that name changed to Mary Magdalene when she becomes the towering figure of strength after Jesus becomes Christos, the Anointed One. But this family of Bethany, or the Friends of Bethany as they are known, were all companions together. This is the rudderless boat that's commemorated outside the monastery of Saint-Michel-du-Var. And the stories then is that this community of pilgrims, this community of apostles here you can see where Lazarus becomes the first bishop of Marseille, that they disperse throughout Provence preaching and teaching together. So they arrive and they begin to convert southern France. And Lazarus's particular domain was in Marseille. Saint Martha went up to the region known as Tarascon, and this is her depicted with a dragon because it was said that she was able to tame a dragon. I like to look at that very symbolically, by the way. But there were others as well. There were the two aunties, Marie Jacobet and Marie Salome, who are mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. as well as this figure, a patron saint of the Romani people, Saint Sarah, who comes to welcome them as they arrive. The Provençal legends say that this was an indigenous wise woman who befriends the whole community of the Boat of Bethany and helps ensure their survival. An image that's depicted in our times by Sue Ellen Parkinson, the meeting of Saint Sarah and Mary Magdalene. And it's said then in the legends that were passed down that Mary Magdalene began to preach and teach in city squares and in forests. And in some of the tales of her that were collected down, it said that the honey of her voice was so sweet with love and compassion that it drew everyone to hear the music of her voice. And all who heard her had their hearts open to the truth and healing power of the gospel. So here's an image in Marseille of the great cathedral around the city square that was built in the Romanesque era around the stone where Mary Magdalene was said to have preached and taught in the Agora. And you find this ancient image. One of her profound symbols is the healing jar of balm, the balm that she used to anoint Jesus, that she came to the tomb to prepare the spices, but also I think symbolically the healing balm that all who heard her preaching experienced, the balm of the honey of her words. There's the cloister garden of that cathedral that grew up around that preaching stone that she was said to have stood upon. And it's said then that companions traveled far and wide all across France. Some legends say that she went as far as Vézelay to preach and teach, that they took the bones of Jesus's grandmother, Saint Anne, to this region in Apt, where there's a feast day to Saint Anne every July, just the week after Mary Magdalene's feast day. And if you go to Marseille, you'll go down into the crypt and you see these incredible images. That image on the left is an ancient image of Lazarus, the first bishop. And the image that you see of the altar on the right is the jar of healing balm. There's another carving of Magdalene with her long flowing hair in this underground first church that was established around the year 50 in Marseille. And it was this church, this underground crypt here. Oh, there you can see Mary Magdalene on the left, and on the right there's the tree of life carved on the pillar, and a black Madonna in the center, a symbol of deep hidden wisdom. That this was the first church of Christianity, and some would argue it's the first church in the Western world, far earlier than the churches established in Rome. It's a place of great pride in Provence. And this then, that Mary Magdalene preached here with her brother Lazarus for many years, but then it became very dangerous and Lazarus was executed and beheaded. So she went deeper into the countryside. And the French legend said that she found sanctuary here in this mountain called La Baume. That's the forest that you see in front of the great mountain. Oh, it's an amazing mountain. And that forest had been dedicated to the sacred feminine, interestingly, for 700 years before she arrived, because it was the forest dedicated to the Greek god Artemis. And she found sanctuary here. And it was right above that tree line. If you look carefully and you go right above the tree line, you'll see a cluster of buildings. So these were the French legends, and the earliest written documents about them, because I always like to separate what is the legend from what we can verify by historical record. And the first historical writing records aren't until the 2nd century. But just like the Bible, like the Gospel of John, and many scholars think the Gospel of Luke wasn't written until the early part of the 2nd century, but it relies on an earlier oral tradition. Well, this oral tradition was deeply, deeply rooted, that this was the place where her relics were, that the bones of Mary Magdalene were kept, and where faithful followers of her congregated and continued her teaching and preaching. Well, we're going to fast forward to this fascinating piece of history then, because in the 4th century, this was the time that I mentioned previously where Christianity becomes Romanized. After the Emperor Constantine is converted, there becomes this movement to do away with other texts and to conform now to the teaching of St. Peter in particular, who had been this patron saint of Rome. There were many competing capitals, should Antioch or Jerusalem or Alexandria, should that be the capital of Christianity? But the emperor liked the idea that it should be Rome because, well, that was the seat of where his temporal power was too. So to join Peter and the emperor became the quest. And thus emerges what is imperial Christianity. And it was in reaction to some of this that there was this great flowering of spirituality in the deserts of Egypt, the so-called desert fathers and mothers of wise people who were really seeking purity of heart. And so they were fleeing into the catacombs of caves in the desert to pursue lives of contemplation where their hearts would become purified through spiritual practice. And this fascinating figure named John Cassian went to those deserts of those desert fathers and mothers, and he wandered from cave to cave getting the stories of these holy men and women. And he gathers them for 20 years before the political currents of Egypt that erupted, and it was no longer safe for him to be there because of controversies. If we think in our own time of what's happened to Syria and how it's no longer safe to be in Syria, you'll have a sense of the political swings that were also in play in the 4th century. So John Cassian took all the learning of these desert fathers and mothers around the very place that these caves of Nag Hammadi and later scripture were recovered with stories of Mary Magdalene. And he went to the east, to Constantinople, where he met some figures who are revered as saints, named John Chrysostom most particularly, and then where he went to Rome and he met the Pope, and they said, all this wisdom that you have gathered together from the deserts of Egypt, you must pass it on. And so he came to France to establish a monastery where he took the wisdom that he had gathered in Egypt and he began to write it down. Now, I can't tell you the goosebumps that I got when I discovered this, because I had been reading his works, which are referred to in the Rule of St. Benedict, for 15 years. And when I came on pilgrimage to this place, this cave of Mary Magdalene, and I hiked through the forest and I went to that site, what I discovered was this was a monastery that he had created for men and women, in which he describes a process of purifying the heart, of how to commune in prayer practices, through chanting of psalms, through reading of scripture, through friendship, what blossoms in the later Celtic tradition as the Anam Cara tradition, and through, above all, through the silent practice, what was known as the prayer of the heart, that the monks here at La Sainte Baume trace back to Mary Magdalene and her time in the caves for 30 years of prayer and silent meditation. And oh, friends, if you walk through on this pilgrim path, through the forest, into this cave, time stands still. You hear the water dripping down the cave walls, and you feel the centuries of prayer that have taken root here, taken root in devotion, inspired by Mary Magdalene. This is the plaque that when I saw it literally brought me to my knees. It says, this monastery was found by John Cassianite and his community in the year 415. 415. Since that time, Mary Magdalene was enshrined as the figure in the history books who had taught contemplative practice of silence and chant and study. Oh, it's amazing to follow this template, because this template is really at the root of traditions that we find thriving all around us. So John Cassian began these double monasteries. He had two of them, one at La Sainte-Baume, the cave of Mary Magdalene, and the other at Abbey Saint Victor, which was that first church that Lazarus and Mary Magdalene had created together as in their friendship, in their brotherhood and sisterhood together. And from this, the Cassianite monks spread all over France, and people came to study with them, to learn from them, to absorb traditions that he began. One of those traditions is pilgrimage on Mary Magdalene's feast day. So to this day, if you go to southern France on the 22nd of July, there will be a procession through that forest carrying Mary Magdalene's relics, chanting psalms that are dedicated to her, through up to that cave, where people will sit then in the cave of their hearts in contemplative practice. It's amazing to see this devotion, a living tradition that involves both men and women in devotion and friendship. And then I was astonished to find out that one of the people who had gone on this pilgrimage and who had studied the writings of John Cassian had studied here at this abbey, Lorenz Abbey, off the coast of Caen. And you could have knocked me over with a feather when I found out that the monk who had brought the traditions of pilgrimage and friendship and psalm chanting, and according to the monks of Lorenz Abbey, even beer brewing, up to Ireland. Because this abbey is where St. Patrick became a monk. This is this red thread of pilgrimage that goes across the centuries, so little known. But it's this tradition that if we have the eyes to see, we'll see inscribed in art, particularly art and art of monasteries. So the image on the left is from the Van Eyck altarpiece, and it's the procession of holy hermits carrying their rosary beads. The rosary, a practice of saying the Hail Marys on each bead 150 times. Well, there are 150 steps up to the cave of the grotto of St. Baume. And there's a whole big controversy about this that I'm not going to get into, but just to say, this is a pilgrimage tradition that when you go on pilgrimage to Mary Magdalene, you also say the rosary for each step that you climb. And here then are the monks with their rosary beads. And if you go all the way back to that cave coming out of that forest, the very first person with a jar of healing balm is Mary Magdalene. So there are hidden symbols. This is the chapter house of the monastery where St. Patrick became a monk. And in later centuries, after the 6th century, the rule of St. Benedict was read in all of these chapter houses. And one of the chapters that was always read was a chapter of the rule of John Cassian, the writings, the institutes, and the conferences. And what you see inscribed on the pillars of these monasteries is very often this symbol of the 6-petaled rose, which turns out is one of the earliest symbols of Christianity, but that specifically has a thread that goes all the way back to the followers of Mary Magdalene's version of Christianity. So St. Patrick took the traditions from southern France, where the traditions of John Cassian had honored the traditions that had been established from communities and generations before that they say date all the way back to Mary Magdalene. And he took them with him to Glastonbury on the way to Ireland, because England claims that Mary Magdalene was one of the founding apostles of Christianity in England as well, that she made a trip before she settled permanently in France, according to some versions, that one of her teaching, preaching pilgrimages was here. And it certainly is fascinating to note that Glastonbury Abbey, at its time, the largest monastery in the world at the time, before King Henry VIII dissolved it, is in fact on Magdalene Street. And if you go there today, much of it has been destroyed in the dissolution of the monastery. The one thing that remains is the St. Patrick Chapel. And what you see on the fresco of St. Patrick's Chapel is some of those 6 of the 7 demons of Mary Magdalene being cast out of her. And there she is again with her jar of healing balm. In that chapel across the wall is St. Patrick himself. So according to British legend, and again, here we are in the land of legends, that he took the traditions that he had learned from France to England from England to Ireland. And he also took with him stories of the arrival of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea. And oh, there's so many traditions here I could tell you that are just amazing. If you dive deeply into their lore, incredible places. With a tower that once upon a time was also known as Magdalene's Tower, but now is known as St. Michael's Tor. Fascinating. But you'll still find archaeological evidence like this. This is the Magdalene Chapel. Well, it's actually on Magdalene Close, and it's now the St. Margaret and Magdalene Chapel. It also got a name change, but it's where the centuries of pilgrims would come to get a meal and to have hospital care as they followed a pilgrim path from the northern British Isles down here to Glastonbury. This was popularized in the Middle Ages by Saint Margaret of Scotland, who was herself one of these deep devotees to Mary Magdalene. And throughout the British Isles, you'll find amazing, amazing testimony to this migration. You'll find it in remote islands of Ireland, where like on the Aran Islands and Inishmore, you'll find reference to something, the desert. Why are they calling it the desert when it rains so much in Ireland? It was because that the monks of France brought the desert wisdom collected by the desert fathers and mothers of Egypt here in their beehive huts, clustered together on a model that comes from Egypt by way of France. There's a migratory path that goes from Ireland to the 6th century to Iona, where legends also claim that Mary Magdalene's teachings thrived for centuries here on this remote island. Oh, here is another extraordinary place of early Christian monasticism that clung to a model that originates with John Cassian, the monk who was writing his books in the monasteries dedicated to Mary Magdalene in France. So we have these traditions that if we know which breadcrumbs to follow, they lead us again and again and again to Mary Magdalene, like these frescoes at the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was one of those pilgrims so dedicated to Mary Magdalene. In fact, his very name, Francis, means little Frenchman, because his mother grew up in the town where St. Martha had preached and taught and had festivals for Mary Magdalene every year. We see inscribed on the frescoes by Giotto these stories of Mary Magdalene's legend that persisted, of her being in the cave of La Sainte Baume and of hearing the songs of angels that she was fed by the bread of heaven 7 times a day, something that some historians ascribe the chanting of the divine offices to. The songs of angels sung by Mary Magdalene and the angels become the so-called divine office of monastic practice. St. Francis, when he wanted to follow a path of purification of heart, also turned to Mary Magdalene and her template. Many of you no doubt know that he refused to become an ordained priest. Rather, he only wanted to preach the gospel and to share the good news. And he would preach not within the confines of a church, but out in city squares and in forests. And when he needed to renew himself with the well of inspiration, this is where he went, La Verna, in the mountains. A climb that is as steep to get to as La Sainte Baume, and you go through the forest and into the rock caves, into a grotto where the water is dripping along the walls. And it's here that St. Francis received the stigmata when he was in deepest prayer. Well, in the place where he received the stigmata is but one thing, one statue. No doubt you will recognize now the long red hair, the jar of healing balm. It is an Easter egg hunt to discover Mary Magdalene as she peeks out through history, through myth, through legend, through art, through music. If any of you have seen the wonderful documentary film about the Scottish land artist Andy Goldsworthy, you might recognize these images. Andy Goldsworthy is a contemporary sculptor who, from all apparent things that he said, isn't religious at all, but this trail of time that he has created, that is a focus of that documentary film, Rivers and Tides, is marked along the way with these cairns, these giant eggs that are 12 to 15 feet tall. When I went there to hike, because I'm a great fan of his, I was shocked again to discover that while it's now known as the Trail of Time, in the Middle Ages, it was known as the way, Chemin de Marie Magdalene, because it stretches all the way to the caves of Mary Magdalene. And those eggs come from the story of her preaching and teaching. The legends are in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that after the events of the resurrection, that she came before the Emperor Tiberius, and he said, those things could no more happen than the egg that you are holding turn red. And that is the tradition in the Orthodox Easter of red Easter eggs. Amongst the pilgrims who have walked this path, this Chemin de Marie, is Catherine of Siena. She went to La Sainte-Baume on the way to confront the Pope in Avignon after he had moved his papacy to those courts. That when she needed courage and strength to do seemingly impossible things, before she went to see the Pope, she first went to the cave, the grotto of Mary Magdalene, like so many centuries of pilgrims before her, to pray, listen in the cave of her heart. So you can follow that red thread through John Cassian to Saint Benedict, to the saints across the centuries. And this leads us to the archetypal Mary Magdalene, because I think, as in this image captured so beautifully by Jose Ribera, one of the reasons why people have sought her out, why faithful saints and Christians and artists and saints and sinners alike, people have turned to her over and over and over, is that when we do read the Bible, when we do notice what's there, we see and we imagine that she must have been this tower of strength and courage. What did it take to stay present for the crucifixion? Perhaps some of you have been present for death. Maybe you have watched a loved one slip away. But I certainly hope that none of you have watched someone beloved to your heart tortured to death. What did it take to stand at the foot of the cross, to chant the words that Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Bible tells us that Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed. The Bible tells us that Judas sold him for 13 pieces of silver. The Bible tells us that the other disciples scattered, afraid, and could not keep watch with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. But the Bible also tells us that she was there for every agonized breath. But she didn't just accompany Jesus through the valley of tears and darkness and sorrow. Her courage, her strength, her devotion led to new life. That she was able to proclaim things and do things that no woman had been empowered to do. That Jesus himself commissioned her and said, go and preach and teach. Go tell my brothers. That she was the apostle to the apostles, doing something unheard of. That it was her word, according to early historians who scoffed at Christianity. They said, this new religion hangs on the word of a hysterical woman. And yet, look what happened from that seed. And this is why I think that across the centuries, when people have been in their valley of darkness, when they have been confronting illness or death or abandonment, betrayal, anything that you can imagine that was filled with darkness and suffering and pain, this is one of the reasons why they have held her close to their hearts as their mystical mother. Some of you might know the story of Artemisia Gentileschi. She was an amazing artist who contemporary art historians compare to Caravaggio. But when she was a teenager, her father's friend broke into her house and raped her. And in those days, women were held in such little regard that there was a rape trial. And in order to decide whether her word was trustworthy, they tortured her with thumb screws and took down everything she said. And even though her assailant was convicted, he never served his sentence. Well, Artemisia found her way to healing and hope, first by painting scenes of horrific examples of violence drawn from the Old Testament of Judith and Holofernes. But eventually she found her way to healing and wholeness because she painted herself as Mary Magdalene, a woman who had been embroiled, as far as Artemisia knew, in sexual scandal, because during Artemisia's time, that letter of Pope Gregory had spread to calling Mary Magdalene a sexual sinner. And as Artemisia wandered through the city streets and people whispered unkind things about her, calling her damaged goods, a sexual sinner as well, she turned to Mary Magdalene for consolation. So here you see her, you see this image, and it's her own face, but with Mary Magdalene's unbound red hair, touching the skull of death, but also staying connected to her heart, because that is what Mary Magdalene has represented across the centuries: purity of heart, the prayer of the heart, the six-petaled flower that opens despite the paradoxes and contradictions of life because of its purity of heart. And that leads us to the mystical Mary Magdalene. If you're watching this, I can't encourage you enough to turn to one of the stories that was a story of early Christianity that depicts Mary Magdalene's as the great mystic. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene tells the story of what happened to Mary after the events of the resurrection. Jesus makes an appearance and he gives a message to the disciples to come into harmony and to reunite with the goodness that is their deepest truth, the deepest core of who they are. There's this beautiful line: "This is why the good, with a capital G, has come into your midst to reunite you with your roots." Well, in the story, which is only 7 pages, it's astonishingly brief, Jesus disappears then, and the disciples are plunged in fear and confusion once more. He's gone, and they're saying, "Oh, what's going to happen to us?" And it's at that moment that they turn to Mary Magdalene and they say, "Sister, teach us the words that you know, that you alone know." And she begins to teach them. She tells them that she has had a visionary encounter with Yeshua, Jesus, and that she has met him in this word, this Greek word, nous, which is like the imaginal world. It's the place of dreams, if you will. It's the visionary place. And she has this dialogue and this teaching, and she's told that she has to pass through these, what are called climates of darkness, these climates that can represent fear and wrath and craving. And she has to confront them and meet them and be able to speak to them and pass through until finally she rests in silence, because it said it was in silence that she was taught by the teacher, with a capital T. So I believe that this is the core of mystical teaching. That cave where she was, where the silent prayer was practiced, and where she was said to have achieved purity of heart through passing all those things that later centuries called the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins were actually a revisioning of John Cassian's writings too. And so she does pass through these 7 deadly sins that assail us all by meeting them with great courage and compassion, qualities that she demonstrated in her life, qualities that we can see in the New Testament. The translation that I most revere is by Jean-Yves Leloup. He began as a Dominican confessor in the cave of La Sainte-Baume, but he heard whispering in the still small voice of his heart that he needed to go in search of the Provençal Magdalene, of the French Orthodox Magdalene. So he, who was once known as a Jungian depth psychologist, who then became a Dominican confessor, now goes by the name of Father Seraphim. And he has a French Orthodox monastery, in the monastery with Mary Magdalene inscribed upon the walls, where he translated the Gospel of Mary Magdalene from the Coptic and from the Greek into French, and offered this fantastic Mary Magdalene as an archetypal figure who is so needed by us right now as we find our way in the storms of life, trying to find our way. The mystical Magdalene, the Magdalene of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, has this teaching that inside each of our heart is this seed of goodness, is the Christ seed. In this passage where the Blessed One greets them all saying, "Peace be with you. May my peace arise and be fulfilled within you." Be vigilant and allow no one to mislead you by saying, "Here it is," or "There it is," for it is within you. It is within you that the Son of Man dwells. This turn inward is why Mary Magdalene has been the contemplative mother across the centuries. We're finding those little pieces that have been lost. And if you read the texts that were recovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, you will find Mary Magdalene peering from those missing pieces as this figure who knows more than all the male disciples, this towering figure of wisdom. So you can explore Mary Magdalene in these other texts that were lost for centuries upon centuries, that have been reclaimed. And what you find there, it's up to you if you embrace them or not. But what I will suggest to you is, at the very least, in no way do they contradict the Mary Magdalene that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And for a Christian perspective on this, I would really encourage you to create a book study during Lent and turn to some of these texts, particularly the Gospel of Mary, particularly the Gospel of Thomas, and to read these 2 works, which a council of interfaith ministers and biblical scholars has said are essential reading for today's Christians. They said, just as the New Testament that we all know should be read, there's 10 other works that also should be included. Works that open our minds, expand our hearts, and lead us on a voyage of discovery that strangely may bring us back closer and closer and closer to those early communities of men and women gathering in people's homes, sharing good news. Part of that good news are these 2 sayings, I think, and one from the Gospel of Thomas, one from the Gospel of Mary. Jesus is asked by the disciples when the kingdom will come, and he responds, when you make an image to create an image, or when you make an image to replace an image in another translation. And the quote I've already said that I want to repeat, this is why the good has come into your midst to reunite you with your roots. I want to show you a few images as we close out this part of our evening together, images that have been created by people from all kinds of different spiritual backgrounds: Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Buddhist, shamanistic, pagan, Sufi, none of the above, who encountering these texts, these words, or encountering Mary Magdalene, many of them in their own dreams, some of them on vision quests where they went as a Buddhist in a vision quest and went into a forest, and what showed up was Jesus and Mary Magdalene, not what they expected, the mystical Magdalene. All of the frescoes that you see here in this monastery were created by a community drawn from different paths. The monastery is the community that began by a Russian Orthodox monk who had a dream telling him he needed to go to France to reclaim Mary Magdalene's teachings. And soon he was joined by the Dominican confessor Jean-Yves Leloup. Soon they were joined by a man who had been a Buddhist modern dancer and a veterinarian who on his vision quest was told to seek out Mary Magdalene and Jesus in the south of France. And finally, after many years, they were joined by a man who had grown up in communist regime in Uzbekistan, but who couldn't sleep for 3 nights after he saw his first icon of Jesus. For a decade, he went to study the tradition of iconography, and the very week where he graduated to being a master, the monastery received a phone call saying, "Do you have anyone who could come and paint frescoes for us?" And so Vadim Gurin arrived at Saint-Michel-du-Var, and this was an image that I myself had dreamed as a scholar, in which I had been piecing together this story of Mary Magdalene as the mystic mother. And as you trace her red cloak, you will find close to her, the very first one close to her, the woman with the long unbound hair, is the real life penitent prostitute Mary of Egypt from the 4th century. But next to her is John Cassian, and above him, Saint Benedict. And if you follow their mystic pathway through the centuries, there you will see Saint Francis with his hand raising to the birds of the air and the wolf of Gubbio at his feet. And right next to him is Hildegard of Bingen. And on, inscribed on these walls are the historical record of saints who followed the Magdalene path, a path to reunite us to our roots through contemplation, silence, song, and a connection with nature that brings us back to the good that is the deepest essence, the Christ within. I want to pause and just invite you to just notice what is speaking inside your own heart. What has most surprised you from what you have seen so far? I'm going to ask Susan, if you would, to pause our recording.
There we go.
So I would really encourage you to try on some new practices during this Lenten period. Try on practices that will connect you to both the new material that's coming out. Gospel of Thomas, for instance, for those of you who don't know it, it's a collection of sayings. It reads like it's what I call Zen Jesus. It's a little saying. Many scholars think it's earlier than the Gospel of Mark, definitely earlier than Gospel of Luke or John. And there's no miracles, there's no death, there's no resurrection, but there are these teaching sayings that if you sit with them, if you talk about them, if you wrestle with them, they really work in you in surprising ways for you to have your own revelation. And so I would deeply encourage you to try on a practice with 2 or 3 people or a large group or your entire cathedral, to start something for Lent. Another thing that I would really love to create apostles for, and I would call you spiritual activists. I began this conversation saying that if we go back to the roots of Christianity, Mary Magdalene is primary. She's not a side character. She's front and center there at the cross. If you expand to include Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, any of these texts, her role gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, one of the questions that I yearn for churches to address is to actually confront this head on and to go to their priests. And it could be something very simple, like every week, how they have the preface to the Eucharist. They have the words, and they will say these words. They'll say the litany with this and this and this, and with this and this and this, and with all the company of saints. And what if you had a drive to say, and with Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles? Just put it in there, one sentence, but imagine what a difference that makes. Or Mary Magdalene, the first witness to the resurrection, or Mary Magdalene, the most loyal witness to the crucifixion, or, you could change it every week, but make sure that her name is there. That's a tiny thing that has seismic ripples in the lives of every young girl who's sitting in a pew in your church. To hear that week after week after week, to have her name, to have that there in their heads, the whole congregation, Mary Magdalene, apostle to the apostles, that begins to rewire and put into place those missing pieces. So this is something that we need a mass movement for, but it doesn't need to be a loud, angry, violent movement. It's just a petition. Could we please have her title? Her title was reinstated just a couple years ago by the Pope. So it's, it has this long lineage going all the way back to the earliest days. So that would be one thing that I would urge. And then, can we get creative about reclaiming early Christian rituals? The early Christian Holy Week began with the anointing of Jesus. So what would it be like if you had an anointing ceremony where a woman anointed the priest for Holy Week? And then you had Maundy Thursday. And then when you come to Good Friday, you actually... there's a really interesting cathedral in Houston, Episcopal Cathedral. And for Good Friday, for many, many years, they have done Easter through her eyes. And they've done like this tableau where they have people play the part of the women who didn't leave and who stay put there. And people get to know their names. Like, oh, who are these women that Mark mentions by name? We have no idea. How many of you know who Joanna is or Mary Salome? We don't know. So what would it be like to reclaim their memory too? I think that's hugely significant. I'll mention right now, this weekend is a 4-day Mary Magdalene online conference that I'm convening with 25 speakers from Australia, France, Mexico, England. And one of the programs that we're doing is working with the women from the Gospel of Mark to name them and to know their stories. That's a huge thing to do. And then to go to your clergy and say, just ask that question, like, we're not paying attention to her. What can we do? Could we have the reading of her at the Garden of John instead of the race to the tomb? Could we have, is there something that we could do to actually bring her where she belongs? I'm sorry, I really get crusade-y about this. It's just, it's so important. It's so important because Holy Week, as I experienced it as an Episcopalian for 25 years, was all about stories of the men. We would start on Palm Sunday and we would collectively read this thing about the crowd crawling crucified, Judas selling his master, Peter denying him, and the disciples all fleeing. And so we would be stuck in the worst aspect of humanity. And then we would go through the sorrow and things. And then the women aren't there. But there is another story that's in our Bible. And that story is actually of faithful, compassionate, courageous women who show up for every step of the way. And that's a story that I would say we need to walk in their footsteps as a society. Don't we need to embrace role models of what it is to be courageous? Don't we need to turn our hearts to what it is to be faithful instead of only playing the parts of those who betray and deny? I mean, this is a really important psychological principle. If you want to affect social change, you have to have good models. We have an amazing model, and we never use her in the church. We never look to her. Okay, I'm starting to get really passionate. But I'm just going to invite you to think about that and think about what could be your little part. You know, could 2 or 3 of you get together and just go up to your clergy person and say, what could we do? What could we do? Is there anything that we could do to bring this closer to the forefront, the way it needs to be, the way it is in the Bible? Let me share a couple of other things through image. So what would it be like? I think you at the cathedral, I think you do Maundy Thursday. Is that correct? So what would it be like to think about having these 2 ceremonies, you know, the ceremony of an anointing, lots of beautiful ways to do that. You can do an anointing on a labyrinth walk. That's gorgeous because the labyrinth, the Chartres Cathedral labyrinth was meant to be used as a tool, a liturgical tool during Holy Week. And so what would it be like to have an anointing on the forehead of rose and spikenard and myrrh, the healing herbs that are associated with Mary Magdalene? Breathe that in to say, start on Tuesday and say, I'm going to walk this week. I'm going to walk in the footsteps of Mary Magdalene, and to smell the smells that we read about when the spikenard fills the room, to actually have an embodied experience of that would bring you closer to Jesus. And then to walk the labyrinth walk, which was seen in the Middle Ages as a symbol of every step was thought to be a step towards Golgotha, so that the center represented arriving there. So what would that be? You could do that on Good Friday, or you could do it on Tuesday, but to have some embodied sense of walking in her footsteps. That is just so, so powerful. So here at Saint Michel du Var, on one side of the altar is Jesus washing the disciples' feet for Maundy Thursday. And on this side is Mary Magdalene washing Jesus's feet. And to make that correlation that this gesture of washing the feet was done by a woman first, and then Jesus says on Maundy Thursday, you will have no part unless you also do this. It's profound. It's profound. The other thing that I want to point to is the number of artists who are just, through painting, through art, through soul collage. You know, if you've ever done soul collage at your cathedral, wonderful experience to take the women around Jesus and do soul collage. And the images that are coming forward right now are images that are expressing worldwide her, I would call it even a resurrection, Mary Magdalene resurfacing. So it's so interesting that this particular photograph right here by Thomas Dodd was done years before the film Mary Magdalene. But the opening sequence is of Mary Magdalene being underneath the ocean and then coming and rising up. That film is an imperfect film, but it does a lot to reclaim her place. And it would be really a great thing to show that film leading up to Holy Week and to talk about what ways it actually does mirror some aspects, as opposed to the Passion of Christ, which actually makes Mary Magdalene into an adulteress. You know, most of the Hollywood films have recapitulated her as a prostitute or as an adulteress. The Mary Magdalene film is the only one that shows her as the loyal witness that she was. And I have to mention this image right here. And I'd like to actually do a little warm up for an activity with this. This is the icon that was commissioned for Grace Cathedral for the installation of the first female Episcopalian bishop. And what you see is the text in Syriac, and it was an attempt to go back and say, well, what would Mary Magdalene really have looked like? And he was actually inspired by the National Geographic cover of an Afghani girl that was so famous on there, but to actually reclaim her Middle Eastern roots. And this is the icon that an image, when I said about the egg, do you remember about how the origins of the Russian Orthodox egg, the Orthodox Easter eggs? So she's pointing to the egg as it's about to turn red. So that's part of what's here. But I want to invite you to just to look at this. And one of the most hopeful signs that needs to be expanded upon, but it was very hopeful, is that the installation of Bishop Mark Andrus happened on the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And he took this icon and he processed it from the side where it is to the center and down the center aisle and read the Gospel of Mary. And he actually made a statement that he hoped that in the years to come that she would be brought from the sides where she had been pushed into the center of the church where she belonged. So knowing that, there's precedent for things. And I would encourage you to consider exploring in your own communities, reinstituting a feast day for Mary Magdalene in your community, where her stories are told, where her gospel is read, where music is sung, where the practices that go back to her as the contemplative mother tree are actually experienced. And my experience is that when people do that, when they go into those practices of Lectio Divina, Visio Divina, writing chants or psalms, singing together like Tese, that there is amazing healing that happens. This is an image done by my friend Sue Ellen Parkinson. She didn't know anything about Mary Magdalene. She decided she needed to learn something. She came to a retreat I gave at Bishop's Ranch where I showed 330 images the first night of the images I had collected. I now have over 1,500, but 330 images at that point. And she burst into tears. And I was so glad that I had this experience with a Cluniac nun who, when I was waiting to go to Tese, told me, she said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I don't know. I just know that I cry every time I sing Ubi Caritas." And she said, vous êtes une Madeleine. She said, "In France, we call you a Magdalene. If you are moved by tears in the face of beauty, then you are a Magdalene. You must follow your tears." So I shared that with Sue Ellen. I said, "I think this is something that you need to follow." So she began to paint icons of Mary Magdalene. And this is one she painted not that long ago, six years ago now, I think, when I said we really need more pictures of Mary Magdalene as the wise elder, as the woman who lived into her 60s, who was still the teacher and the preacher. We don't have enough images. So she painted this, and I bought it for St. John's Episcopal Church in Petaluma, who had some really damaging, traumatic things happen to women. And they stood in front of this the day it was installed, and they wept. They wept. There was so much healing to see an image of women in the church the way it needs to be. And what I've experienced is she whispers to us differently. You know, she whispers to us in the depths of our heart, but white or black. You know, here's images from a Mexican artist who paints in the Byzantine style, Mary Jane Miller, who takes traditional painting styles, but she's depicting the Mary Magdalene of the Nag Hammadi texts and the Gospel of Mary. And what it does to see these, it does something enormous to the painter, of course, but how do you feel? Look at the image on the right. And when you see Mary Magdalene and his most beloved, cherished disciple, the disciple of Jesus, and they're both teaching. They're united in their teaching ministry. How does that affect you? How do you think that would open hearts of people? I was in a small group where someone said they had such a hard time going to a church because the feminine was so missing. But to see an image like this on the altar, would you feel more welcome? Would it invite you home? And it's not some new age, newfangled thing. This is what was there in early Christianity. And so it's so fascinating how these images are coming forth, new images. This is an artist from New York City who literally puts the text of the Bible. She's been commissioned by someone who will be speaking at the Magdalene conference, who was so upset in her Catholic church by how there weren't actually depictions of Mary Magdalene that were biblically accurate, that she's gone on to commission all kinds of images. And this is one of them where it's like, okay, just in case it wasn't clear, we're going to write the text from the Bible there, and we're going to show what actually is there. And then we find other pieces that are coming forth from people who didn't think they had any connection to Christianity whatsoever, that are also amazingly powerful. So I'd like to do something with you just right now. I'd like to invite you to do what I call a warm-up for Visio Divina. And just take your paper and take an image. We'll take a couple of images. And looking at it, I'm going to invite you into this practice that's really connected with the Orthodox tradition of looking at an icon and imagining the icon looking at us. I want to invite you to gaze at this image. And I want to invite you to just respond to the prompt. Begin your sentence as if the image, as if Mary Magdalene is telling you this, is writing this to you. What I want you to know is, I'm going to invite you to put your hand up and then unmute and share. I'd love to hear a few voices of what came with that image for different people looking at it. Helen.
So I get it. What I want you to know is there is another side to the very long darkness. The rose is still there. It comes again.
Mm.
And when you are the creator of the light in the darkness.
Beautiful. Another voice. Great. Kristen.
I want you to know that you are a whole, beautiful, deeply spiritual woman. You have much to give to the world, and you will do that one small bit every day.
Thank you. Another? Pumpkin Queen.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just get in. I'm a little late, I guess, about the time I missed something. But what I want you to know is how much I want to learn and share about you. And I want to know how to teach love and peace in the same way like she did.
Thank you. Thank you. Gail, did I see your hand go up?
Sure. What I want you to know is your realizations and seeing are going to be heavenly balm. Tell them how beautiful they are, and when you see them, spend the healing oil.
Spend the healing oil. It's great. Anybody else? Joanne.
What I want you to know is you are loved for who you are. Be strong and work for peace.
So how did it feel for those of you? Oh, Elaine, great. Go ahead and go. One more. We'll need you to unmute.
I live in your heart. Open your heart to the world. Tell the story of your heart's journey. It is in every man. It is in every woman.
So I just invite you to notice how much wisdom is coming through this exercise. I noticed as people were reading, a lot of you were nodding your heads as if it was a message that was really resonating with you. This is another practice that you can do in community, in small groups. Go online, find an image of Mary Magdalene that speaks to you, print it out, and then have each person just gather together. And we did a very short dive into this. Often when I teach this, we have 20 or 30 minutes of writing pages and pages, and it's amazing what comes. And then it's amazing too, when we read and share that together, how sometimes one person's words are exactly what we needed to hear. It's really an extraordinary technique. Would anyone like to speak about what the exercise felt like, this practice of Visio Divina? What feeling do you have in your body, or anybody notice, a change? Anne, please speak. Yeah.
Yeah, different from all the others, I felt very deeply touched. What I want you to know is you are loved. You are my beloved child. I am she. I am in need. I long to be the one.
Yeah, there's something about this practice that goes straight to the heart. And this is what I have found with the Magdalenian tradition, particularly the monastic tools that have been passed on through the centuries, the monastic tools cultivated by John Cassian and then disseminated in monasteries. They open our hearts so that we can connect to the eternal wisdom and be able to really hear that still, small voice inside. And in all the years that I've been working with this tool, it's always been a deeply positive experience for people, something that really feels consoling, nourishing, comforting in a really deep and beautiful way. So I would encourage you to do that. And so here's just a couple of ideas for restoring Mary Magdalene in your communities. The two books that I would say, start with is The Gospel of Mary, or The Meaning of Mary Magdalene. Create a movement within your church to include Mary Magdalene, the first witness to the resurrection, as part of the prelude to the Eucharist. Create a watch party for films of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and talk about what is and is not biblical. And then you may wish to join with your friends. There's 2 events that are happening soon. Saturday through Tuesday is the Mary Magdalene online conference. And there's a group rate that's on that. So if you join as a group, you can have, 1 admission and then share as discussions. And then the deepest dive of all, I really, having read so many hundreds, maybe thousands of books that were really, really dry, I wanted to gather everything that I have learned on my quest, including what I wrote my dissertation, but have it be not just something in the head, but something that goes to the heart and actually is a lived experience. And so I have a 40-day program for Lent that's 40 days of Mary Magdalene and the Garden of Mystics. There's 22 posts on there that go in detail with the history of who she was in the Bible, how she got changed by Pope Gregory, what happened over the centuries. There's a long thread, who she was for St. Francis and his communities. And then there's additional Zoom meetings and community gatherings. And every Sunday, there's a compline service of music and meditation. Three Saturdays during the program, I'm going to be exploring the works of John Cassian and what he wrote when he was in that cave of La Sainte Baume and how it's mirrored in the lives of people like Brother Roger of Taizé and Eddie Hillesum and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote a book on Mary Magdalene and who was just following her thread throughout the centuries. So I would love, love, love to have you be in that gathering, which begins on Ash Wednesday. And all the videos, all the Zoom sessions are also recorded if you can't attend live. And if you'd like to know more, my whole life looks like it's still going to be continued to be focusing around Mary Magdalene one way or the other. So you can get on my email list on www.kayleenasbo.com. And that will tell you about the threads, including in-person pilgrimages. We have a couple of spots left for the one this July. So if you want to walk through the forest of La Sainte Baume, up those 150 steps to the grotto, and go and pray and meditate in the caves and see the frescoes and go to the sites that are associated with her teaching and preaching with Lazarus, it's an amazing experience. And I'd love to have you on for that as well. So I think we have down just a couple, if there's any last minute questions, because my part of this was going to end at 7:30, and then maybe you wanted to continue as a group talking about how can we make this happen at Trinity? What can we do? But any last questions that you have for me around Mary Magdalene? I will tell you, it is the most extraordinary thread. It makes me fall in love with Christianity and with Jesus over and over and over, to find this, to find the people inspired by this, to find it's such an amazing thing. When you read, it's like reading with 2 eyes, to read the what we have in our tradition, and then to add this rich body from Nag Hammadi, from the pilgrim traditions, from the lives of the medieval mystics. I mean, I'll just point out one more thing. Like, it is amazing how many people go back to Mary Magdalene. My favorite mystic from the Middle Ages for a long time was Julian of Norwich, first woman to write in the English language. She wrote her Revelations of Divine Love. Do you know how that book begins? It begins, I prayed to follow in the footsteps of Mary Magdalene. That's how it begins. That's how she had her revelation. So if you want to draw closer to her, make a little altar, light a little candle, and ask her to show you her way to Jesus. It might just blow your mind. Thank you all.
Yes, I just want to say thank you so much, Kayleen. I mean, as you were talking before, I had already thought about something, asking the dean if we could do something, on the Maundy Thursday along with the foot washing anointing, some women anointing. So I'm just going to take the pledge. I think I'll take Helen with me, and we'll go into his office and we'll see what he says. I think it would be amazing.
All right.
I would love it if you all become apostles for the apostle to the
Yes.
apostle.
Indeed, indeed. But thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And I will definitely send out to everybody. It'll be on e-newses and to each one of you the recording, and just I'll be listening to it over and over. So thank you so
Great.
much.
And may you go ahead and share the recording with your friends, because
Yes, please.
Magdalene deserves a movement.
Wonderful.
Start with you.
Thank you,
all.
Kayleen.
you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
thank you.
Kayleen.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Kayleen.
Thank you so much.